As we wander down through the years and various things happen to us, it is sometimes rather easy to feel that the world's against us. Actually, however, this is a rather arrogant attitude. For the most part, the world does not know that we exist. And with this comforting generality, we can proceed to a more detailed consideration. Actually, our problem is one of the individual's relationship to an unknown. The unknown to the average person is always threatening. It is rather hard sometimes to understand why, but probably we have to go back to the atavistic beginnings of our pre-cultural period. Man began as a creature very much isolated. He struggled against a vast world around him, and of course this world was filled with hazards, then as now. By degrees, the individual divided his world into two parts, the known and the unknown. About the known world, the known way of life that was his own, he gained some insight, was able to face it. He was also able to face its dangers. He recognized them as calculated risks. He knew that he had certain enemies and certain friends. He knew that the dangers of the climate of his world, storms, tidal waves, these things had to be faced. But to the degree that he understood them, he learned to face them, or accept their inevitable consequences with a good grace. That which he did not understand always became part of his theological concept. What he could not rationalize, he emotionalized. And in his emotional extension, he tried to explain, perhaps in terms of the known, the unknown. Very often the explanation was faulty. Even his explanation for the causes and reasons for the known were not always correct. In any event, he gradually divided his world into things about which he had certain common sense, and other things about which he had very little common sense. And that which he could not understand became like a crystal ball, and he looked into it and sought for an explanation. And if he gazed into the ball long enough, he started a problem of psychological projection and found an impish or diabolic face staring back at him. He did not realize that this face originated in himself. He did not realize that the terrors of the unknown were really terrors in his own psychic compound. But he at last came to the conclusion that outside of the known, outside of the understood and the accepted and the ordinary, there was something extraordinary, and that this extraordinary thing was hazardous, was dangerous. Here again, symbolism may have shown him that the earthquake, the tidal wave, the terrible storm, the hurricane, the cyclone, these things came out of the unknown, and they were dangerous. Perhaps he came finally to assume that the things which he could not control were his enemies, that he must be the victim of that which was greater than himself. The unknown is always greater than the known. And even as we proceed along the way of intellectual existence, and we conquer one unknown factor after another, the mass of the unknown is not diminished. It is still vast, mysterious, terrible. And now out of it comes the fear of invasion from other planets. The fear that rays out there may burn the earth to pieces. Fear, fear, always fear. Man worshiping God as the creator of all things remains till now frightened to death of the works of this benevolent creator. The reason he is frightened is because of his moral sense of guilt. If he really believed he was living well and serving his God and serving his brother man constructively, he probably could accept deity as benevolent. But due to his own conduct, he has the subconscious suspicion that he is in line for punishment, and he fears punishment. These different elements gradually close in around our small personal ways of living. We discover that as individuals, we live in this twofold environment. A small world of things we understand. We may not like all of them, we may resent many of them, but they seem within the range of normalcy. We have only the normal reaction of acceptance or rejection. But outside of this small world is again the vast sweep of the unknown, of vastness and greatness. Or perhaps we reverse this procedure and we move from surfaces inward. We observe that on the surfaces of things we have some comprehension. We know the way things look, and if they act according to our expectancy, we have a certain sense of security. But beneath the surface of things, there is another kind of unknown, a subconscious, a subjective. We are frightened to death of our own subconscious. We do not know what is inside of ourselves. And we're always afraid that if we relax, some terrible pressure will break through. We likewise are afraid of that which lies beneath the surface of our culture. We are afraid not of the appearance of our neighbor, but of his nature behind the appearance. We suspect that behind the persona or mask of his frontal aspect, there may be someone lurking who wants our house, who will be perfectly willing to steal the hose from the back faucet. If anything is mislaid, we suspect everyone. And then we discover we've mislaid it ourselves. But this does not cause us to become less suspicious of other people. When our suspicions are justified, we are very sure of ourselves. When our suspicions are not justified, we do not learn from this. We adjust the suspicious the next time. Our empiric ground being that the ground for suspicion is valid, always. Occasionally we may make a mistake, but this mistake in no way changes the general fact that everything around us justifies suspicion. As we go along suspecting more and more, we discover that suspicion has a positive aspect. Suspicion as a faculty or power has been given to us for a reason. It is a kind of challenging faculty. A suspicion presenting us with discomfort, for suspicions are always uncomfortable, challenges us to solve a mystery. What we suspect, we should investigate to find out whether there is truth in it or not. And we should investigate with an open mind and with a natural seeking for fact. This we seldom do. We have lost the value of our suspicion faculty. Instead of trying to disprove it by fact, we determine to prove it by fact or not fact, whatever is required. Suspicions to us are emotions that must be justified. And we look around us and we see so many things happening. We read so many accounts of persons who have been exploited. We hear so much of crime. We even come into rather personal contact with so many evidences of man's inhumanity to man that it does not appear that we could possibly be wrong if we suspect the worst under almost all conditions. This situation can, however, lead to a dangerous psychosis. And when persons naturally inhibited or frustrated or inclined to be neurotic begin to cultivate suspicions, they are on a fair way to be very sick people. We cannot afford these doubts and fears, even though there may be apparent ground for them. There is also a very peculiar psychological factor that we have to take into consideration. There's a saying in the Bible that what we fear comes upon us. And suspicion and fear, no doubt, do produce, to a measure at least, the fulfillment of themselves. Now you might say that this gets into a rather abstract atmosphere. It is not really as abstract as we think. A person wrongly suspected also loses certain value in life. I've had them come to me and explain that their very good and perhaps very reasonable intentions were completely misconstrued, and that when this happens on a number of occasions, the desire to do nice things or to try to be helpful, this desire gradually diminishes. If we are not accepted with a certain amount of faith, there seems to be little incentive for ourselves to be faithful. If we are not recognized as of good intention, then there is very little inducement for us to exhibit good intention. False suspicions, therefore, can destroy friendships that might otherwise flourish, and can deprive us of many privileges and opportunities which might otherwise be ours. The suspicious person is reducing the size of his own world. He is decreeing that he will live in an atmosphere of doubt and fear, whether the cause be there or not. Now, it may possibly be that in the course of our lives, we shall accept someone, trust them, believe in them, and be exploited or robbed or injured by that person. This can happen, and it can cause great bitterness and a disinclination to have further faith in people. On the other hand, it is far better to more or less forget such an isolated incident than it is to cling to it. According to the statistics that we have available at the present time, approximately 3 million persons in this coming year will be guilty of some offense against society. Some of these offenses will be of a criminal nature. Others will take the form of misdemeanors. But we will have 3 million persons. Of these 3 million, probably 25% will be motivated to their antisocial conduct by tremendous personal intensity. In other words, their action, whether a crime or a misdemeanor, will be unpremeditated. It will arise from a circumstance which has exercised more pressure than these individuals can withstand. So out of approximately 175 million people, about 3 million will be troublesome. That leaves us a reasonably stout percentage of individuals who probably will be rather decent people. Our probabilities of coming under the direct influence of violence, other than that on the highway, due to carelessness or mechanical defects of cars or something, our probability of coming into violence is very small. And the majority of persons live through their entire lifetime without any serious act of violence being performed against them. They will have certain misfortunes, certain difficulties, but most of the problems will be of a personal nature, resulting from the deceit of friends or relations or socially unadjusted situations. This percentage does not justify the tremendous mass of suspicion which so many persons hold. It does warn us that we should not complacently go on, failing to make the necessary remedial steps to correct crime and misdemeanor wherever possible. It causes us to know that we must take reasonable precautions. But it is not the ground for this tremendous sense of pessimism that burdens so many people. If we use reasonable caution, protect ourselves with long-range plans of intelligence and common sense, the real chances that we'll have serious trouble are not too great. Certainly not great enough to burden our entire life with suspicion or negation. Nature tells us, in no uncertain terms, that it does not wish us to hold negative attitudes. Nor will it condone us in these attitudes, whether they be justified or not. Nature recognizes no difference between unrighteous indignation and righteous indignation. Nature does not like indignation. Nature does not like criticism or condemnation or bigotry. It does not like suspicion or fear. It does not like any of these negative and destructive attitudes. And in nature, these attitudes are criminal offenses against nature. The individual who holds such attitudes is therefore doing himself much more damage than even a criminal situation in nature could do to him. He is in much greater danger of loss through his attitudes than he is through burglary or through a holdup on the street. This might occur to him once in a lifetime, but his attitude will plague him day and night, injuring him, robbing him constantly throughout his years. The unknown, therefore, while it is a mystery, we cannot afford to permit this mystery to serve as the basis of a series of negative attitudes. We have to fight this in some way by organizing ourselves against negation. Most persons in the course of a thoughtful lifetime find ways to combat some of the major manifestations of their own negative instincts. After we have allowed ourselves to suffer from a massive hallucination of some nature, we sit down and say this is pretty ridiculous. And we have a heart-to-heart talk with ourselves, and we agree that we shall not act this way in the future. And perhaps having learned an important lesson, we are more orderly and reasonable in our conduct. The fears and problems that beset us most are the small ones that continue to nag us in our characters and against which we create very little defensive armament. We can rise to an emergency, but we do not react well when this emergency is habitual. We react against some extravagant expression of unreasonableness, perhaps because of vanity. We do not like others to see us make fools of ourselves. But in the long daily grind, many of these habits and temperamental peculiarities simply go on unchecked and unconsidered. We just assume that that's the way it is, and other people will have to learn to like it or else. And of course, we're not very happy when the other people choose or else as their reaction. To meet this, we must begin to look for negations appearing in our instinctive reaction to life situation. I know several families in which today, with transportation as it is, unusual and extreme stress is rising in connection with members of the household who have long trips to make to and from work. I know several families where the man has to drive 30 or 40 minutes home from work. If he is 10 minutes late, the wife begins to visualize an accident. If he is 20 minutes late, the visualization fills in. If he's 30 minutes late, she is in hysterics. She's sure he's been killed. Well, you cannot have hysterics 2 or 3 times a month from such causes as this because your freeway traffic is frequently congested unreasonably. Some people adjust to this. They realize the traffic situation. Others cannot. When the pattern is broken, it means disaster. In time, this hysteria is going to undermine the entire character of the person. They're going to become frightened, neurotic people, not companionable, and less valuable to come home to. Yet this person simply is unable to adjust to the fact of living. Now, you cannot say to her, it could not be that there will be an accident. You cannot say to her, there is no possibility that your husband has been hurt, because she knows that accidents happen. But the percentage of accident and the probability of her being involved is remote. It can happen. But with her, it is happening once or twice a week sometimes, as far as her entire nerve shock is concerned. She is having this happen in her home every time this man, for reasons that he cannot prevent, is late in arriving. Such situations as this represent poor adjustment with known facts, and poor adjustment with real responsibilities. This family has children. These children are subjected to this psychic shock through the mother. Something should be done about it in the problem of sitting down and facing realities. Otherwise, there will be real and definite damage. The mere fact that each time this happens, the man comes in the door unhurt, never discourages the fear. It might be the next time. This is the mystery of fear, that no matter how often it is disproved, it is never overwhelmed by any rational attitude of that nature. Against fear, evidence is powerless, because fear by its very nature is irrational. And as long as we live in a world in which danger exists, the emotion of fear cannot be entirely blocked. The only answer lies in the gradual estimation of value, the gradual recognition of the law of probabilities, and a certain interior sense of value, faith, understanding, intelligence, reason. These must gradually come into focus, come into action, and help us to overcome the fear mechanism. Another interesting type of fear is one associated with a kind of psychological situation, not too common in its more vital form, but rather common in its application, and that's fear of appearance. A man with a clubbed foot as a result of a congenital situation allowed this foot to completely dominate his life. He was utterly incapable of meeting people or mingling socially without this terrible sense that everyone was noticing his deformity. His natural tendency was to run and hide. Certain individuals, foolishly, probably without any real intention to do harm, would either stare at the foot or make some remark. This completely paralyzed the individual and left him isolated. He was afraid of friends. He was afraid to establish a family. He was certain that no woman would ever want him. And he went on building barriers around this foot. This kind of situation dominated him for about half a lifetime. And then one day, it got so bad and so impossible that, as the man said afterwards, he said, I either had to do something about it or blow my brains out. Well, it takes more courage to blow your brains out than it does to do something about things in most cases. And being a coward, he did something about it. And he gradually came to realize that actually no one cared. Half the people he met or worked with either did not even notice his trouble, which was not especially obvious, or if they did, they just said, well, so what? He can't help it. No one really cared. He discovered a little later that there was a fine woman who didn't care, and he made a home and raised a family. He suddenly realized that the whole thing had been in his own mind. Now, this is a common situation, but let's apply it to other things. The individual who is an inch too short, or 3 inches too tall, or has a 1/16 of an inch more on the end of their nose than they think is right, or is underweight 10 pounds or overweight 10 pounds, creating psychological pressures. The individual who does not like the color of their eyes or their hair or has freckles or a wart. These people ruin their lives and themselves and others by simply suffering with situations that no one cares anything about except themselves. And these negative acceptances which they allow have a very bad effect because they provide excuse for failure. And no one is entirely immune to the need for some kind of an excuse occasionally. When affairs do not go well, it is much easier to blame the 1/8 of an inch or the 1/16 of an inch on the end of the nose than it is to blame the vacuum inside the head. It is much better to feel that other people have misjudged us from our appearances than to realize that they have correctly judged us by our conduct and have found it wanting. These escapes of race, of religion, of appearance, all these escapes are wrong. They turn the individual from the simple fact that it is possible for him to achieve. If he places achievement where it belongs in his consciousness and works toward it properly and intelligently. Nature does not want us to be afraid except within a certain gamut of sensory perceptions. Nature wants the individual to be afraid of fire so that he will not burn himself. Nature does not wish the person who cannot swim to be completely without fear of water. Nature does not wish us to endanger ourselves by foolhardiness. Therefore, it has planted within our natures a certain warning, a certain protection against doing things that might endanger survival or health or happiness. Nature admonishes us and causes reflexes to arise within our consciousness to warn us that this is not good or that is too hazardous. But nature uses these to protect ourselves or protect us against ignorance or against situations which are not within the scope of our comprehension. Nature also expects us to use these admonitions to encourage the development of proficiencies. The man who is afraid of water has a simple answer. He must learn to swim. And if he learns to swim, his fear of water will correspondingly diminish. The individual who has a fear of light must live, must face life. And as he begins to understand it, he will discover that it is not nearly so dangerous as he thought. Another important issue that comes into these situations is social prejudice. In society today, we are plagued with all kinds of dissatisfied individuals and groups. We have persons whose greatest joy in life is to condemn something or to criticize someone. The morning mail brings it every day. The most frightening, devastating exposés of this and that and the other thing. Horrible indictments against persons and organizations and officials. These various publications would not be permitted to be distributed in most countries, but here we can distribute almost anything. The same mail may bring completely opposing indictments. I've had a certain individual, the object of a tirade in one letter, picked up another piece of free publicity and find the same person elevated practically to sainthood. There's no consistency in it. There's no rhyme or reason in it. Everybody is moving from something they heard someone else say to someone else. Then there are various groups who find certain advantage, financial and otherwise, in the theory that if you will criticize someone, you will always have an audience. We love it. But these kind of pronouncements are frightening to people. I receive material in the mail which from the standpoint of psychology is dangerous, very dangerous, particularly to persons who are not too well integrated or not too well established in their own convictions. These persons could be moved into the most frightful difficulties if they would listen to these half-baked utterances of other foolish people. So when you are surrounded by the streams and currents of these dangerous-sounding reports, they build up fear. They cause the individual to doubt everything and doubt everyone. They cause us to look for difficulty. And they cause us to interpret simple things in a very complicated and often malicious way. After we have been deluged with enough of this, we must either do our own thinking or drown in this ocean of other people's bitterness. Many persons do not make good decisions at this stage of the game, and they permit themselves to be continuously over-influenced. I would feel, therefore, that most of this type of news, and it is bad news, should be met in a rather simple manner. The average person's ability to do anything about these matters, whether they be true or false, is extremely limited. About all that anyone can do is pass on a rumor. If the rumor is unpleasant, unkind, critical, destructive, there is grave question as to whether it is anyone's duty to pass it on. There are various agencies and factors also deluged with the same rumors, whose duty it is to investigate them. It is not ours. It is rather our duty to make sure that negative attitudes moving in on us do not destroy our relationships with those who are dependent upon us and whose responsibilities in our living are real and immediate. It is very little use in this world to neglect that which is within our area of possibility in favor of something that is not. So the person who allows his nature to be undermined so that he is no longer a good business associate and no longer a good social person, no longer a good family person, this individual has accomplished nothing. But he has certainly made life increasingly difficult for many others. Our first problem is to work with those responsibilities that are within our means, within our range of action. And only when those have been successfully met should we begin this problem of looking outside for further worlds to conquer. But to leave the real and immediate possibility or neglect it, or to champion causes as necessary, when this championing means neglected children themselves rising up to become social problems, this is not good. Fear may cause us to come into a frenzy. We've had them frequently come to us with these perturbations. Some years ago, everybody was expecting both the Atlantic and Pacific seaboards to slide into the ocean. More persons sold property at a loss than you would ever want to know. Another group was quite convinced that a new continent was coming up west of Catalina Island, and they were trying to figure some way to buy the ocean there. There was a tremendous upheaval. I remember seeing artistic conceptions of New York slipping into the sea. Millions dying together. It was a beautiful thought. Why does not someone have a pleasant idea of something lying ahead? Must disaster always be news? But in order not to be topped by New York, some other artist had Washington, D.C. going with it. Now, the possibility that Washington gradually sinking under an unbalanced budget is possible. I have friends who actually bought areas of land up in the state of Washington mounted machine guns at the entrance to these areas which they had set aside, and were determined to fight and die in the defense of this hidden land in which the survivors from some disaster were going to gather and take shelter. Incidentally, the man behind the machine gun, who was going to give his life to save these other persons, died of dyspepsia in bed a few years ago. He was never a martyr or got near it. Instead of the enemy on the outside, it's possible that fear gave him such an unbalanced hydrochloric acid content that the body couldn't stand it any longer, and finally dissolved because life was no longer worth living. These things come along continuous. There is no end to them. You do not get rid of one more than a few days before another appears. There is never a moment when the most horrible prophecies about something are not floating in space. Why is it that in all of these activities, in all of these wonderments, we must always choose something terrifying? How is it that good news does not take the same powerful place in our thinking? Psychologists point out that 50% of our people are already neurotics. This being true, we know that one of the basic principles of a neurotic is that good news is always false. That's one of the basic principles. A neurotic has lost the ability to think straight. A neurotic, in order to justify his own neurosis, has to imagine that he's living in a neurotic world. Nobody can feel miserable all the time and accept the blame for it totally themselves. They must push this blame onto society. Society must be wrong, or the neurotic cannot justify his own attitude. And because there are things about society that are wrong, they become the evidence by which the neurotic maintains his right to his attitude. He is always able to point out a particular incident in defense of his own attitude. What he cannot, however, realize is the hundreds of millions of contrary incidents that do not support it, but which he carefully ignores. So in this problem of negation, we find the tendency to slip into it because it is a common social state. We hear people say, I'd like to apply for the job, but I'm sure I won't get it. Or the person who will go somewhere and buy something and say, well, it won't last till night. They never do. And nobody does things right anymore. We're off. Well, a lot of this is true. There are faults that are definitely showing in our society. Quality is diminishing. Sense of values is depreciating rapidly. But we are creating a vicious circle by failing to do anything constructive about it, accepting it as inevitable, and then dissolving in self-pity because of the way this depreciation is affecting us. The fact it's costing us more for the inferior article makes us have a legitimate reason to be sorry for ourselves. And in the face of this agony, all other pain is unimportant. The person, however, who is rebellious against depreciation and adulteration and the lowering of production standards. This same person is the indefatigable bargain hunter who goes out continuously and tries to find something for 5 cents less. He gets something that is worth 50 cents less as a result. If this person really demanded in his daily transaction a fair grade of merchandise and refused to buy anything else, and enough persons held this attitude, we would have good merchandise. But we have nothing but complaint and negative, frustrated acceptance of that which is no good. And as long as we'll buy it, there'll be somebody to make it. Nothing remedial, only negative worry, despair, criticism, but not the action that will produce result. We also note that the worrier, the fusser, and the fumer is seldom a person of action. Occasionally, we will get an inconsistency here. Some people can fuss and fume and be terribly busy. But the tendency is against it. And where the fusser and fumer is terribly busy, a careful research may find that they are busy walking around in circles, that this busyness is not as constructive or effective as might first appear. Your neurotic is not by nature busy. Your neurotic is a person who creates false jobs for themselves, and down inside knows that the job is false. Therefore is never really actively dedicated to what they are doing. One type of neurotic who has the means, out perhaps in the Beverly Hills area, will work it out by refurnishing a house every year. Tear out everything that's in it. Give it away, throw it away, or sell it for 1% of what was paid for it. So they are terribly busy redecorating every year. This isn't work. This is just plain fussing around. The individual who is doing this has some terrific area of sterility in their consciousness. They are empty for the real values of life. They are frustrated, disillusioned people. Another group will extrovert into some other meaningless way of keeping active. Meaningless social contact. Meaningless chit-chat and small talk. Meaningless semi-civic activities that have no real substance in them. These escapes of the neurotic are the way that this type of person tries to relieve the pressure of their own negative thinking. If they do absolutely nothing, they will frighten themselves to death in 3 months. They cannot endure their own negation. So in order to do something to keep their mind off themselves, they develop these projects which could convert no one into the belief that they are significant. But the neurotic, not being a person of action, is nearly always inclined to an exaggerated, negative, internal nature and consciousness. They are wells and flowing fountains of morbidity as the neurosis expands. It is not possible for these people to live alone and like it. It is not possible for them to adjust to the fractured living which they themselves have broken up by their own reactions to life. If by any chance a neurotic happens to be fairly wealthy, this makes it worse, because then they are deprived of the need to go out and support themselves, which is one way of keeping busy with some significance. But the person who does not need to work, and at the same time does not have a constructive basic philosophy of life, is in a terrible spot. And there are too many in that spot today. This means that these neurotic fears build up. And one person who becomes panicky or becomes emotionally frightened or disturbed can have a very detrimental effect upon many others. We know that delusions of masses arise from the hysteria of individuals. A good example was Germany under Adolf Hitler. One hysterical man projected his delusion upon a people normally a rather sane, scientific, thoughtful, thoroughgoing people. And in a short time whipped the emotions of these people into a madness that very nearly destroyed the world. The hysteria of the unbalanced becomes a serious ailment in the fabric of society. And while in many instances, most instances, it does not produce immediate national catastrophes, it does injure the smaller units of society, particularly home and business, making the individuals involved a detriment to each other and themselves. So out of this situation of anxiety and fear and doubt comes this old saw that we hear about so much: the world's against us. The world is not against us. But we have defamed the world. We have told so many stories about it that were not true. We have insulted it to its face and behind its back so long that perhaps we have a right to assume that it resents us. We have abused the world. It is not what the world has done to us that is the pity and the scandal. It is what we have done to the world. Because of its own nature and quality, it's a rather likable spot. It has rather unusual extremes of climate, but there are people who like all of them. And there are a good many people on this earth that would be perfectly miserable if the temperature wasn't around 120. And there are others who would feel lost and forgotten if it did not go down to 70 below zero in the wintertime. People like all these differences. They challenge imagination and living. There are people who like all parts of this world and will do so if we will give them a chance. Most persons do not live too rigorously or under the terrible pressures of climatic uncertainties. We live a comparatively soft life. We live in comparative luxury because of the abundance of the earth and the treasures which it has. So it is our own psychological institutionalization of living that causes us our anxiety and our uneasiness. It is not the world that is against us. It is our own kind that perhaps we only imagine to be against us, even as others imagine that we are against them. This brings us another little problem that comes up particularly in modern days. And that is that we have learned to take the attitude that any individual who is for himself is against us. And this makes the whole world stranger. Actually, most persons are interested in themselves. They want to achieve what they want to achieve. And if they are intellectually and ambitionally strong, they may also be ruthless. So each person doing that which he wants to do does so generally ignoring the desires of others, perhaps because for the most part he does not know what others desire, or assumes that if they want what they want, they should do what he does, go out and get it. These attitudes result in what we like to term the cold, cold world, where most people seemingly are wound up and absorbed in themselves. Well, of course, there's certainly a certain part of mankind that is so wound up. It is very easy to pick out groups of people and say this group is against you, or this group is damaging you. And I have on a number of occasions met people, known people, who are among the so-called despots who are against someone. I know cases also where an individual who ran down very continuously and consistently a public personality, finally, after many years of criticism and condemnation, met the personality for the first time, and was amazed to find a very genteel, very charming, and pleasant individual who was almost irresistibly likable. It was embarrassing in the extreme, because the picture that had been held in the mind was not at all like the person when we actually met them. This can happen also because we build so much and imagine so much, and if we have a little insomnia, we fill in the whole background. It is so difficult for us to get over this belief that we live in a very isolated relationship with other life, and that it's every one for himself, dog eat dog, and that we must some way fight through to success if we wish to get there. This business of the whole world always being opposed really has to be analyzed a little, because it seems so obvious, and yet when we get down and work with it, it just simply is not true. Yet it can be defended, it can be maintained and demonstrated. Yet it is one of those strange logical truths that is a falsehood. And there is nothing more false than logic, which has therefore been termed a doctrine of fallacies, not because it detects fallacy alone, but because logic can create fallacy and can defend it so admirably that only real, honest common sense can break through this fabric. Actually, the average person does not live in a world that is really against them. They live in a world of people for themselves. And they also today live more in a world in which survival is a matter of wits. Today we are more than ever required to strengthen our own resources if we are to continue to live fairly secure lives. It is very easy to be imposed upon. It is very easy to be deluded or to be cheated in these hectic times. Everyone is moving under such pressures, and the almighty dollar has become not only so important, but so lacking in value content, that the stress and pressure of living makes life seem very heartless. And it is, to a measure, heartless, unless the individual does what nature apparently intended him to do, and that is realize that these crises come into society because human beings make mistakes, and that the only way out of the crisis is for the individual, the human being, to correct his own mistake. If he will correct his mistake, his crisis will dissolve. Actually, I've watched for many years people who are imposed upon. And in most instances, one of two things is true. Either this person is unreasonably gullible, is simply lacking in the development of the most common and ordinary faculties, or else this individual is himself dishonest and has been imposed upon while he was trying to impose upon someone else. Now, there are exceptions, but each person who is in this difficulty is reminded that it would be much more useful to try to straighten out this interior situation than to waste energy being sorry for ourselves or criticizing the world in which we live. This criticism is a total loss. Even if it's true, it does no good. It only gives us acidosis. And with this acidosis, we may require medical treatment from doctors about whom we are also very suspicious. So we get ourselves into these difficulties. The more suspicious we become, the more antacids we will need. And yet we are quite certain that the advertising on the antacids is simply to cater to our acidity. Go right around the circle again. When we observe over a period of time that we seem to be the victims of programs of deceit and exploitation, when it seems that every time we buy something, we get something that's no good, that every time we sign a contract, somebody breaks it. When this program settles in on us, this is the last moment when we can afford to talk about how bad things are. This is the time when we've got to begin to figure out how foolish we are and do something about it as quickly as possible. In times when there was very little competition, when industrial organizations were not great and living wages and standards were low, ordinary common sense of an hereditary nature might have taken care of us. But in the world that we live in now, the only way in which we can be sure on any subject is to know that subject, to understand it better than the other person does. We won't always succeed in this, but theoretically, if we could, it would help. And when the problem arises and we are not successful, and we are duped or cheated, then we have to realize that it is actually a challenge to ourselves, that we have to accept this as an extravagant and perhaps expensive lesson. But it is not something that should cause us to hate others. It is something that should cause us to dig in and protect ourselves against repetition of the incident. Always when we are exploited, we must try to understand that it is because we are not universal geniuses. Well, we're not, so we will be exploited to some degree. But when it happens, it is an invitation for us to grow, and not merely an invitation for us to hate somebody. If we can get this positive attitude, every challenge will pay off in self-improvement. And after all, the self-improvement is what we're here for. In 50 years, it will make very little difference whether we were cheated or not. We will be one with the ages. But we must take into whatever lies ahead the consciousness we have gained. And this consciousness means that no matter how much it costs to learn, it is worth it if we learn. And no matter how much trouble we save ourselves, nothing is valuable if we haven't learned something. So every challenge, every doubt, every emotion that is wrong tells us there is something we must learn. Any attitude which, if held, makes us sick is an attitude we must outgrow, regardless of how easily we can defend our right to the attitude. We can definitely see we have a right to be angry the way we were treated. Anyone has a right to be angry. Well, we have a permit permitting us to be angry, but the rate of interest on it is about 60% per annum in sickness, misery, and trouble. We have a right to be angry, but if we do become angry, we have no right to complain if it costs us our family, our friend, our job, and our community respect. Those are the payments for the privilege of being wrong. And to be angry is wrong, regardless of justification. Now, someone will say, well, psychology doesn't say that. It says if you get mad, have a good temper fit and let it out. Psychologists have been doing it on themselves and each other, and the result is they're all going to psychologists. The fact remains that a destructive attitude is not right, because nature tells us what is right. And nature tells it to us in terms of body chemistry. Anything that biochemically or psychoneurotically or neurologically damages tissue is not right, regardless of what we call it. Any attitude which will give us an ulcer is not right, regardless of the provocation. Nature says it isn't right. And nature says it by striking us at our most vulnerable point, the body in which we live. And we can be just as right if we want to be, or as we think we are. But in all the midst of all this rightness, this body collapses. Then we're not right. And no amount of justification of any kind can go against the fact that certain attitudes destroy elimination, disturb heartbeat, may lead to electric breakdown in the brain, and that these attitudes, if held long enough, shorten life, encourage illness, and cause the body to lose its resistance to infection or contagion. Any attitudes which do these things to the body and to the person are not right. And there is no way of justifying that which nature denies. So the individual has to get over this concept that the fact that the world around him is unpleasant justifies him in being unpleasant also. The world around him is sick. If he does what the world is doing, he will be sick. If he wants to be well, he has got to protect himself by not doing those things that make him sick. There is no other answer. So the temptation to be like everyone else is a temptation that will lead in the end to the troubles that we realize that everyone else has. To be like them, to share in their excesses and extremes, means to also share in their penalties and their disasters and reverses as recorded each day in our faithful press. So if you want to do these things, remember that you do them against the final criterion, the effect upon yourself. It is far better, then, to realize that you have to live with yourself. Other people do not have to live with you. Perhaps you do not have to live with them. Perhaps you would like to live with them. But you do have to live with yourself. You cannot live with your own psychological disturbances any more than you can live with a bad case of acidosis. You are suffering constantly in yourself. And if this suffering is due to your attitude toward other people, the situation is basically ridiculous, because you do not need that attitude any more than you need the acidosis. But if you have one, you're going to have the other. To discontinue these attitudes of negation must therefore be in the book. It is according to the way it should be done. But this, in turn, does not mean that the individual has to develop a bad case of Pollyanna-ishness. Anyway, it's a good thought. Anyway, you can have it any way you want to. You do not have to develop this. You do not have to agree that all these things you do not like are right. You do not have to close your eyes and say they're not there. You do not need to be a hypocrite or to be self-deluded or to deny anything. What you have to do is recognize facts and work with them without emotional imponderables. It's very possible that if you started thinking things through really carefully and intelligently, rather than feeling them through with tremendous intensity, you could actually correct half of the problems. Or if you cannot correct them, you can determine your own proper relationship to them. No one gets acidosis merely because he's a good student. He only gets acidosis from this type of thing when emotional pressure distorts his perspective or so intensifies his attitude that his judgment suffers correspondingly. There is no reason to agree with what you do not believe, or close your eyes to the fact there are problems in this world. But by conserving resources and not becoming emotional about these problems, we protect ourselves and have a much better possibility of solving some of these problems, especially as they relate to our own lives. Also, if we will take the symbolism and apply it immediately to the small incidents around us, certain immediate victories can be attained, whereas larger and more massive problems will not so quickly respond. Get away from this idea for once and for all that the world is against us, or that we were created for disaster, from the old meaning disaster. meant in ancient times an evil star. We were not really born under evil stars. Actually, each individual is either the master of his destiny or the slave of his emotions. He is either strong enough to live well, or he sacrifices that strength merely to cater to the whims and follies of his own character. He has to decide his course of action. The world is neither against us or for us. Most of the people we know would be for us if they could stand us. And if they can't, there's something we ought to do to help them out. There is no reason why an individual should like us for what we are and then have to put up with us for what we do. There's no reason why every acquaintance should be a heavily mixed blessing in which we have to ignore all the faults in order to enjoy the constructive aspects of character. We expect to overlook some faults, and we expect others to overlook some of ours. But we do not need to become complete wholesalers immediately. We have a right to give to other persons that aspect of our nature which is the best controlled, the best directed, and the best organized. If our friendship is of any value, we should give the best of ourselves. We have a right to hope that other people will do the same. If we set a good example, it is much more likely that others will follow it. I happen to remember one time when I was out socially on one of the rare occasions, and a lot of chit-chat going on. The door opened and a rather quiet, middle-aged man came in, shook hands. Everyone seemed to like him. The chit-chat stopped instantly. There wasn't any more of it all the time he was there. I asked someone afterwards what was the reason. Well, they said, this man is a very well-liked person. We respect him tremendously. And we know that he does not tolerate gossip. So while he's here, no one gossips. He won't tolerate it. Well, he did quite a little for the digestion of the entire group. The refreshments probably rested better on many a stomach that night. And it is quite true that if we indicate our own natures on these things, if we demand a certain standard, it will either be given to us or those who do not wish to make this adjustment will depart. If, however, we proceed to let barriers down, others will. If our every indication shows how selfish we naturally are, other people have a perfect right to be the same in their own thinking. Thus we challenge no one. We simply drift with a common tide, and this tide flows into trouble. If, on the other hand, we do have certain principles that we adhere to, and they are admirable, others will want us to believe they have the same principle. And we will find their cooperation is not as difficult to secure as we might originally have thought. All through life, if we look at troubled lives, we find people who have been troublesome to themselves. We know that all lives have their troubles and their problems because no one is perfectly able to manage his own affairs. But a philosophic insight which implies that we could or should strive to organize our attitudes is a proper insight. And it will lead almost immediately to the realization that cause and effect operate, that this is a universe of law and order. And the reason we are in trouble is because we have caused trouble. And the only way out is that we shall cause solution. For this fact that we are in a lawful world, ruled by cause and effect, the unadjusted person must ultimately be the cause of his own problem. If he is not, there is no justice in the universe anywhere. We prefer to believe that justice does exist, but we see too much evidence of universal intelligence around us. We also choose to believe that man is responsible for his own conduct, rather than to accept the idea that some arbitrary divinity forces him to be good or bad. It is much more reasonable that man shall sow and reap according to his own sowing. That if he sows the whirlwind, he will reap the whirlwind. If he does not do these things which are necessary, he is afflicted. But these afflictions which seem to pour out of space upon him are really relationship values, symbolically set up between himself and others. The psychological chemistry of life means that the chemistry in each one of us flows out around us to affect our environment and becomes the basis of our acceptance by other persons and to a measure our acceptance of other persons. These things we can control far more than we know, and experimentation on several levels have indicated how quickly and effectively the individual can change his life. The friendless person can have friends. The timid individual can gain confidence. The frustrated person can gain proper and useful outlets, but not merely by complaining, only by setting in motion corrective causation, setting about to make right these wrong things that have been penalizing the person for years. Instead of thinking that the world is against us, it would be far better to remember that the earth is a great area of fertility, and that each form of life draws out of nature that which is necessary for its own nutrition. The worrier draws out of nature energy with which to worry. The artist, energy with which to paint great pictures. The scholar, energy with which to search into the mysteries of knowledge. The earth supplies energies. Man uses or abuses these energies. If he uses them wisely, they strengthen him and give him security. If he uses them unwisely, they turn upon him and plague him. It is his own use, his own character through which these energies must move that determines the security or insecurity of his life. No matter how heavy the burden of social motion may be, if there is a law in nature, no individual can actually be penalized for the collective attitudes or conditions of other people. There is no law that says that we have to be wrong because every other human being is wrong. Nor is there any law that says we cannot be right if all these others are wrong. And there's no law that says we have to be penalized if we are right because the world is wrong. All of these adjustments are lying within ourselves. If the individual makes use of the powers, faculties, and energies that are naturally his own, and gains a reasonable insight into the faculties and problems of living, he can lead his own life toward a proper haven. If, however, he is loaded with vanities, demands the approval of others, then he must live as badly as they do. So he is not destroyed by others, but by his inability to lead his own life in a constructive manner. And this does not mean in a pig-headed manner or an opinionated manner, for this will do no good. It means that he must live a life that he has learned to understand and value, that he has devoted the necessary time to self-understanding and self-improvement, that he knows what is right is important, that he has the courage to do it is more important. But the individual who, knowing what is right and having the courage to do it, this individual knows the world is not against him. The world is against what is wrong, whether it be in him or in anyone else. For the world is now nature and human instinct locked behind the superficial appearances that may be catering to error. Down in the roots of archetype, all light knows what is wrong. And in these roots of universal archetype, universal energy moves. It supports what is right and will not support what is not right. And the alignments of human beings around these patterns result in the situations that arise. That which is not right receives no natural nutrition, turns upon itself, devours itself like a disease, and destroys others with it if they have accepted it. That which is right supports and defends, and whether we admit it or not, the universe stands always with the person who is right. And in the presence of this defense, there is really no need for any person to feel slighted. We are not in this situation that we're doing the best we can, the world won't accept it. We are actually in the situation of confusion and disordered action, which is not useful. Therefore, the world cannot accept it. But if we will straighten ourselves out, we will find that the harmony of the world moves through the person who has put harmony into his own conduct. Time's up.